Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. The Battle of Baldtop. On top of a hill called Baldtop, located in the hill country on the continent, lived a small tribe of goblins. The goblins had lived on the hill for many years. They farmed their fields. They occasionally stole the cattle of neighbouring settlements. They were born, and then they lived, and then they died. But far from Baldtop, the world was changing. Sea levels were rising, and the cities on the coast were flooding, and the men who had inhabited those cities were moving inland, looking for new lands to settle. And so it was that in the 32nd year of the Common Reckoning, Baldtop was attacked by a warband of well-equipped fighting men. The goblins of Baldtop were not a warlike people. Most of them had no weapons, other than those that they used for hunting. But Baldtop was their home, and they determined to fight for it. Thus it was that their chieftain, Brolic, assembled a force of some 350 goblins to defend the hill. The goblins were not well equipped for military purposes. Most of them had access to one-handed axes or machetes. Some 50 goblins paired these with shields. Brolic himself had a mail coat and a two-handed axe, which, in more peaceful times, he used for felling trees. About 75 goblins had homemade two-handed spears. The remainder were armed with a motley assortment of hunting equipment. There were around 100 goblins with javelins, 50 with light hunting bows, and 50 with slings. Around the summit of Baldtop was an enclosure, and around this enclosure were the dwellings of the goblins. Brolic placed his spear goblins, and those with axe and shield, within this enclosure, split into two groups. At the wall he placed his slingers, where they could hurl slingshot at the approaching enemy. The ground below Baldtop was a patchwork of farmland and forest. In one such patch of woodland, to the right of the hill, Brolic placed his javelineers, and his archers in another such patch of woodland, to his left. The men of the coast numbered approximately 200. Of these, around 125 were clad in full armour, with shield and sword. The remainder were unarmoured, but carried shields and slings, with long knives at their belts. Their commander was named Taran. Based on previous experience, he expected that his men would slaughter a few goblins and the remainder would run away. The goblins' livestock and grain pits would feed his men for a while, and then his force would move on and find another settlement to pillage. Taran's plan was simple. Send his slingers forward to disorientate the goblins with a hail of slingshot, while his armoured men charged up the hill and into the village, slaying anyone who chose to stand in their path. Seeing the goblin slingers on his right at the wall atop the hill, Taran sent about 50 of his slingers forward toward them. He sent his remaining slingers forward on his left to cover any threat that might emerge from that quarter. Behind the slingers, his heavy infantry began to advance. The opposing slingers exchanged slingshot, and both goblins and men suffered casualties. At this point, Brolic blew his horn. On his left, the goblin archers advanced out of the woods and started to loose arrows at the slingers on Taran's right flank. At the same time, the goblin javelineers charged out of the woods on Taran's left and into his slingers positioned on that flank. But the goblin arrows had little effect, and, although outnumbered, the slingers on Taran's left seemed to be holding their own against the sea of goblin javelineers washing around them. Taran decided that attack was the best form of defence. Cut off the beast's head, and its claws will cease to strike. He ordered his heavy troops to charge up the hill and into the compound. They surged over an undefended section of wall and into the group of goblins waiting behind it. But even as the men charged, goblin arrows began to find their mark, and goblin axes found their way past shields. Taran watched with horror as on both flanks his slingers were eliminated. Apart from anything else, he had not joined in the assault on the compound, and he and his bodyguard were now isolated at the bottom of the hill, with hostile javelineers to their left and hostile archers to their right. Meanwhile, within the compound, Taran's men were kept at bay by the goblin spearmen, who drove them back. But they were able to close with the shield and axe-armed goblins, and killed many of them. As the attackers lost cohesion and the fighting became confused, Brolic led the other group of goblins in the compound, charging into the flank of Taran's troops, felling many of them with his axe. Faced with this unexpected resistance, the attackers retreated from the compound, back down the hill. The javelineers had finished slaughtering slingers, and, exuberant with the scent of victory, turned their attention elsewhere. Half of them ran toward the retreating heavy infantry, pelting them with javelins, which had little effect. The others charged Taran and his bodyguard and cut them down. Annoyed by the pin-pricking rain of javelins, the heavy infantry charged into the goblin javelineers. But, exuberant as they were, the goblins were not going to fight against an enemy who were roughly equal in number to them, but better armoured. They ran away and gestured menacingly at their foes from a safe distance. The surviving men of the coast regrouped and retreated from the battlefield. The goblins jeered their defeated enemy, but otherwise let them retreat unmolested. Thus ended the Battle of Baldtop. But their victory only won the goblins temporary respite. Within a few years, all of the goblin settlements in the hill country had been pillaged and burnt, and that land was inhabited only by men.